And good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're located right now. On behalf of HRSA's Maternal and Child Health Bureau, I wanted to welcome you all to the first official day of our 2021 Maternal and Child Health Epidemiology training course. As I mentioned in my introduction webinar last week, you're a very select group of trainees. There are 49 of you from over 200 applications representing 36 states and jurisdictions. We have folks as far away as Hawaii and those further northeast in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and as well as down south in the Virgin Islands. As I noted last week, we have 10 states with multiple representatives, as many as 4 in Ohio, and 3 of you each in Arizona and California. We also have 5 states that have trainees at both the state and local and or tribal levels. And we really like to see that to foster collaboration and synergy at state and local levels. I also want to thank CityMatch for managing and coordinating the course, assisting with course planning and the schedule, and arranging all of the logistics, including in this virtual platform, which is our second time doing this and hopefully our last for a while. We have a great 3 weeks of training ahead and getting to know one another. And I just I can't say this enough, this really is a unique and rare opportunity. It's kind of like an adult summer camp with bonds that may last a lifetime. And I want to just remind you about some key tips to really get the most from this course, especially in this virtual format. Really use this opportunity to focus. It's roughly 2 hours out of the day. And if you can, just answer emails later in the evening or before the lectures start. I know over the course of the last year and plus, we've all gotten quite used to doing virtual presentations and things of that sort, and it's very easy to get distracted by emails and other things. Also, I want to just highlight that this is a good opportunity for peer-to-peer exchange. Share seamlessly, steal shamelessly. While we don't have our usual in-person reception lunches and group outings, we do have a lot of virtual FaceTime spanning over 3 weeks. And I know in a little bit, we're gonna do an exercise for folks to get to know each other. Please ask lots of questions. No question is dumb. Every question is important and it helps everyone to learn. So ask away. We're here to answer any questions you have. Also seek technical assistance now and after the course. It really is the faculty's greatest privilege and satisfaction to see the material being applied. So we welcome any questions or technical assistance related items that you have, particularly as it relates to some of the topics that we're covering here today. If you feel more comfortable reaching out via email, that's great. Send us an email anytime. We're happy to meet with you either during the office hours or during other times that are available for everybody. We're not going to go around and do introductions for each of us today on Zoom, but I wanted to remind you that in the Teams page in the general information, there is a PDF that describes each and every one of you with a photo and information about yourselves. So I encourage you to look through to get to know each other in that way so that you'll start to recognize each other during some of these sessions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our extraordinary coordinator of the course, Dr. Mike Smith, who's going to take us through a fun get to know you activity.
All right. Hello again. I need to start over. Hello again, everybody. How are you? I hope that you're doing well. It's good to be here with you. And what we have planned, I hope it's a little bit of fun to get to know each other some. So the activity that we have planned is to go into breakout rooms of 5 or 6 people or so in a breakout room, and among that small group, your task will be to come up with the title of a report or a white paper or something like that that would be interesting or useful to all of you, right, in the group. So talk through kind of what you do, things that are meaningful in your work, and come up with a title of a report or a white paper that would be interesting or useful to everybody. So we're going to break into breakout groups of 5 or 6. You're going to have about 20 minutes in those breakout groups to chat. When you finish, if you finish early, you can just chat. Although we are a group of epidemiologists, so sometimes there is a overrepresentation of introverted personalities. So if you need a topic to fill the rest of the time, you can try to come up with a cool name for your team, right? Something like the regressors or the collinear modeling agency, or something like that. So, but the primary task is to come up with a title that you think would be interesting or useful to everybody on your team. Then we're going to come back together to this big group. Somebody write down your title and appoint somebody to share it with everybody. When we get back in this big group, each of the teams will share your title. We'll put them on I'll share my screen and I'll try to keep up and type them in on a Word document. And then Ashley will pop up a poll question and we can all vote on which one we think is the best title. All right. Okay. Any questions? All right. Ashley's going to help us break out.
Just give me 1 minute to assign those rooms.
All right, we have another minute if anybody has a question.
Are there any length limits, word limits to the titles?
There are not, but remember that people are going to be voting on it. So, think about what makes a good title.
Okay. You should be able to see breakout rooms appearing. And invited to join your breakout room.
Just want to say I really love the energy that I've seen. And how am I going to do this? Sorry. There we go. Oh, I see. I wonder if I have to share. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to figure out how to share my screen. All of a sudden I've forgotten. All right, let me try this. And do you see my slides now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, excellent. Okay, we're on the right track. So yeah, I really like the energy of the group and the names and the titles. I think it's all great. So congratulations. I definitely saw many runner-ups with some great titles. So we're going to be talking about social determinants of maternal and child health today. And before we begin, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. As we gather today, we acknowledge the myriad traditional and sacred lands on which many of us are standing. Many of us are in geographic locations which have been sites of human activity, starting with Indigenous peoples for 15,000 years. The land where I'm standing now is the territory of the Anishinaabe peoples, including the Petun First Nations and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community that we now call Toronto. I'm a visitor on these lands, and my own Indigenous peoples from which I descended are from the Hashiman Nation in the southwest corner of the USA where I was born. I'd like for each of us to take a pause and consider the Indigenous peoples that have lived and live in your own communities and acknowledge the history that settlers have had with those indigenous peoples. I'm mindful of the broken treaties and covenants on both sides of the US-Canada border and the need to strive to build greater trust and make right with all of our relations. So as we progress through this talk today, I'd like for you to keep in mind some key messages. The first one is that research on the social determinants of health will help create a fairer society. And I think you get that idea based on the titles that you just provided for your reports. However, if we just focus on documenting inequities by social determinants, that's not going to be enough to bring about the necessary societal changes for maternal and child health populations. And also, epidemiologists can benefit from some more capacity building and specialized skills and tools and approaches to research social determinants well. Okay, so remember last week, Mike presented to us the new public health competencies, and at the middle, I don't know if you remember, in the center was this idea of equity. So definitely what we're talking about today is health equity. And health equity is, sorry, Mike, there we go. The attainment of the highest level of health for all people by addressing avoidable inequalities for those experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage or historical injustice, so that all people and communities can achieve the highest level of health. And the reason we link it to the social determinants is because addressing the social determinants of health is the primary approach to achieving health equity. The social determinants of health are underlying and contributing factors of health inequities. So let's get going and talk about what the social determinants of health are. I will mention that there's a lot of experts in the field and people talk about the social determinants of health differently. So let's see how closely what I bring to the table today aligns with what you've heard. I also wanted to let you know that there is poll everywhere that we're going to be using for our polls, and I see it's cut off here, but it's pollev.com Pato Campo 199. So let me see if I can fix that so that you can see it better. There we go. All right, there we go. So poll everywhere, Pato Campo 199, and we'll be doing some of the polls. All right. So here's one depiction of the social determinants of health. Oftentimes, there are a list of determinants, and in this case, with the Kaiser Family Foundation, they're kind of clustered into groups: economic stability, education, healthcare system, and they're all somehow contributing to health and social outcomes like mortality and morbidity, functional limitations, economic and social well-being. And we can't forget at the top the historical and political context of each one of these determinants and categories of determinants. But you know, one challenge I have when we present lists like this of the social determinants of health is that it gives the impression that these issues are in fact maybe simple to understand and solve. And then there's no way to kind of determine, is there a different weighting that I should give to, say, employment versus provider, linguistic, and cultural competency? In fact, these social determinants are multi-level and quite complex. So I thought we might take a deep dive in one of them just to get a good understanding. So let's start with housing then. Some of the statistics that I'll share show you just how challenging it is to understand housing as a social determinant. Some data suggests that across the US, 1 in 4 renters pay 50% or more of their income on rent, and that was in 2015. I suspect that there's a trend and it's not getting better, but it's getting worse. In fact, New Haven looked at their own data and found that proportion of renters spending 50% or more on their rent increased from the period 2005 to 2014 by 16%. There are a number of families that actually need some kind of assistance with housing one way or another. But when we look at some of the programs and determine who's eligible, only a quarter of those families who are eligible actually get any kind of assistance, leaving 3/4 behind. Evictions are of growing interest to a number of policy people and researchers. Milwaukee did some extensive studies about evictions and reported that every single day, 40 people get evicted. And all of this has health impacts. And so suicides have increased or doubled due to foreclosures and evictions from the period 2005 to 2010. Now, a lot of that was due to the economic downturn in 2008. But all of these housing issues have severe health consequences. I want to talk about the 4 domains of housing that we should be considering when we're studying housing. There's physical, financial, and I would say those are the 2 that we tend to focus on. And certainly they're really important. Take physical, for example. We know that physical features of housing, whether it's ventilation, whether it's indoor air quality, heat and cold, damp and mold, those things they all contribute to serious health issues, from allergies to asthma to other respiratory kind of illness, infections, even cancer. And so physical features of housing are certainly important, as are financial. But 2 that we tend to ignore are locational. For example, how many resources are available in or near your neighborhood? And then psychological. I think that's the one that we tend to ignore the most. Although many studies and even realtors suggest that that's the most important. A home can be the source of pride and status for individuals. A home provides something called ontological security. That is the ability to be in control of a space. So occupants of homes are in full control of a space, which isn't true, for example, in employment or out in public. And it's a place where they can be fully free of any kind of surveillance. And so ontological security and psychological security of housing is very important. Now, not all individuals experience these dimensions of housing equally. For example, there are big differences between men and women. Let's just take a quick peek. Women, for example, are more likely than men to live in substandard and crowded housing. Some of that has to do with the fact that women have lower wages and are more likely to be or underemployed. There are more single mothers who are living in poverty than single fathers. And if women do get social assistance, it rarely fully covers household expenses. Women also have fewer choices about where to live. Some of it is cost, as we mentioned before, but there's discrimination by landlords against women and lone mothers. And there's a greater need for women to be close to, say, their children's schools or to services. So that even further narrows their ability to have choice about where they live. And then finally, for the psychological aspect of housing, women and single mothers compared to men are more likely to live without psychological or physical security in the home. Now, I should let you know that these things don't travel together, and that makes it difficult to design solutions, because you really have to address each one of these dimensions of housing separately. And I think another feature to know when it comes to women and mothers is that in some jurisdictions, if women are precariously housed or they're homeless, they are at high risk of losing their children to Child Protective Services. along the lines of not everybody and not all women experiencing housing in the same way, if we bring race into the equation, we can see other challenges that are faced by especially Black women. There have been emerging data that show quite a bit of support that, for example, the individuals who experience the most discrimination against securing a mortgage are Black women by far. We also know that segregation limits the where Black individuals and Black women can live. And so all in all, Black populations and Black women tend to experience lower levels of security on all of these dimensions here that I've mentioned. Speaking of evictions and speaking of Black households face the highest risk of eviction, regardless of education. So here's some data from 2017 showing eviction by race and age. So you can see for Asians, whites, Hispanics, and Blacks, that Blacks have the highest rates of evictions at every educational level. In New York City during COVID-19, at a time when there were mitigation strategies put in place against evictions, we saw a drop in 2020 of evictions for Asians, for whites, and for Latinx. But for Blacks, their eviction rates doubled over an 8-month period. So we can see that not everybody experiences housing insecurity in the same way. So when we go back to our, oh yes, I wanted to mention that there was a recent study published, and you may have already seen it, by Himmelstein and Desmond just this year, showing that a history of eviction in the year before giving birth is associated with increased risk of shortened gestational age and also preterm birth. So it definitely has implications for maternal and child health populations. So going back to our framework for the social determinants, we can see that in fact, each of these social determinants is neither simple nor straightforward to solve or to study. And in fact, they're probably very much related to each other. So when we were talking about housing, we certainly referred to and mentioned several other social determinants of health, whether it's employment or income or debt or discrimination. And there's others that I didn't have a chance to mention, but that housing is related to those determinants. So it's important that we depict our social determinants in a way that we can understand the relationship to each other. And along those lines, I want to share with you another framework that I tend to rely on as well. It may not contain a list of social determinants, but it certainly shows important pathways. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the World Health Organization Commission on the Social Determinants of Health that generated a report in 2008, a landmark report, Closing the Gap in a Generation, urging decision makers to put in place initiatives that will close the inequalities that appeared in every single country urgently, quickly, rapidly in a generation. And they generated this framework to help understand and explain how inequalities are created. And I think there's a couple of things that are important to point out about this framework. The first is that we can group social determinants into two groups: the intermediary social determinants on the right, and those are really based on individual characteristics, the ones that we often see measured in our EPI studies. But then we've got the structural determinants of health, and those are important because, as the chair of the Commission on the Social Determinants says, those are the causes of the causes. They're the root causes. And so if we can study those, understand them, and intervene on those, we're more likely to make a bigger impact in terms of addressing inequities and the social determinants of health. So I've certainly said a lot, so let's catch our breath and do a little bit of a summary. So the social determinants of health are multi-level, there's structural and there's intermediary, and they're complex. They rarely work in isolation, rather they co-occur with other social determinants, and they must be studied as both intermediary and structural determinants. So how does that line up with our EPI approaches? Our EPI data and our methods, frankly, are better suited for individual level risk factors. So much of our data is really about individuals. So that means that in order to do this really well, we will have to go the extra mile to include intermediary and structural social determinants, to consider relevant context, whether it's historical or political, to explain our social determinants, and to link the impacts of multiple social determinants in our studies. So that's kind of the end of the first section. And I wanted you to be aware that I kind of thought of some questions that it would be good for you to have the answers to. And this is what I hope you got out of section 1. And I thought we might maybe do our first poll. I get this annoying thing that keeps coming down. I hope you don't see that. So maybe we can go to our first poll right now. And hopefully you were able to get on. I think I've activated one. Let's see.
I also put it in the chat too.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Yes.
Excellent. All right, let's see what we have. Stop sharing that one. Let me share the other one. All right, here we go. My knowledge of the social determinants of health is at an introductory level. The fewest said that. Solid. I'm aware of several social determinants of health. Oops, that one's going up. And then very good. So maybe I'll let you answer. I'll take a sip of my tea. That's fantastic. That's great. Okay, I'm going to give you one more. So the next one is, I think I have to activate it. So tell me, I think you type it in, it'll be a word cloud. What social determinants are you aware of and do you care the most about? Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Okay, it looks like, oops, it keeps changing. Great. We've got some good ones here. Really exciting. Thank you very much. All right, so I will stop sharing here. Okay. All right. Okay, no, I need to share my screen. Okay.
Looks
Okay.
like
All right. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how well epidemiologists have studied the social determinants of health. And let's see, let me just do one last thing. There we go. Okay. I've already talked to you about our need to study both the intermediary and the structural. So I just grabbed a couple of studies, very recent studies on housing to see how we did. Did we study both intermediary and structural, or did we link the social determinants of health to one another? So the first study I pulled was looking at housing conditions, and those are physical housing conditions and birth outcomes. When they looked at these physical housing conditions, they were things like crowding, dampness, mold, and ownership, indicating that crowding and mold were related to birth outcomes. Didn't look at any of the other dimensions of housing. 2 studies looked at essentially what is homelessness. This one called it severe housing insecurity in birth and infant outcomes. And this one looked at homelessness and looked at childbirth delivery outcomes. Here, homelessness in both studies were demonstrated to be associated with birth outcomes. Not surprising, given how difficult it is to be living rough. And then finally, there was a study just looking at unstable housing, precarious housing, and pregnant people. So really, these studies are fairly typical of EPI studies, looking at a single dimension of housing, not really linking it to other social determinants, even though we showed how tied up housing is with other social determinants, and didn't really go beyond kind of the individual to look at the systemic and the structural. So we really need to be doing a better job. There we go. So back to our framework from the WHO. It's important that we really study both the intermediary and the structural, and not just because we need to be comprehensive. We do need to be comprehensive, but we have a bit of an imbalance here. We have some structural research, but if we were to take all the research that we have on the social determinants, probably less than 10% is really on the structural determinants. Another reason is that if we fail to study the structural determinants of health, it's going to lead to either non-existent or very weak evidence on informing sound policy or program design. And I want to take some lessons from another important field of study, and that's the study of poverty and poverty alleviation and poverty elimination, where poverty researchers too contend with the same issue about having a lot of data about individuals. And I want to show you the consequences of not including structural determinants. Now, in the 1990s, there was a time when there was an incredible opportunity for poverty researchers to inform the redesign of a program about poverty alleviation, the welfare program. So there was welfare reform in the 1990s that led to the creation of TANF, right? Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And Alice O'Connor looked at the extent to which poverty knowledge, the millions and millions of dollars spent on poverty research, how that was able to inform the policy, the welfare reform. And she came to the conclusion that so much of the research informing welfare reform relied on data at the individual level. And she noted the problem was with what was being left out of research. Because of data limitations, poverty analysts rarely incorporated institutional practices, political decisions, or structural economic changes into their research. The focus was on individuals and their families. Consequently, the data made it easier to think about poverty as a failure of individuals rather than a failure of an economy in which middle and working class, as well as officially poor Americans, faced diminishing opportunities. And so there was a failure to include those structural determinants. So the policy was designed around individual attributes, whether they were married or not, whether they were working or not, and not about those structural determinants. We don't want to have the same fate for epidemiology as we think about trying to make an impact on the social determinants and reducing health inequities. Another way in which we could improve is we should be thinking more carefully about the issue of social theory and how that informs our work on the social determinants. So let's take one of the issues that we see commonly, and I know this is an interest for this group here. We often generate patterns by race for adverse outcomes. These come from vital records data about race and 2 adverse outcomes: low birth weight and smoking and pregnancy. So now it's your turn to either type in the chat, or you might want to unmute. So maybe you can tell me, why are we interested in race as a social determinant of health? Don't be shy. Okay, so to target where to find programming, thank you. So we might target certain racial groups, okay. Anyone else? Oh, because there are inequalities in health outcomes by race, okay. Are we interested in race itself? So I'm hearing you say that these are groups that we're interested in. Race has systemically been tied to other social determinants. Okay, race is a social construct. Thank you for that. All right, anyone else? Race cannot be changed. People cannot change their racial group. Okay, thank you. So I guess I would ask the question, and because we have access to individual race data in most cases, yes, I think that's a very practical truth there that we have to pay attention to. Thank you for the additional answers coming through. So I wonder, do we think race itself is the social determinant? Are we measuring the right exposure? And do our interpretations draw from sound social theory? Some people made reference to race not being biological, for example. If we were to listen to Dr. Kamara Phyllis-Jones, who was commenting on the race differences that were noted during COVID, the mortality differences by race, Dr. Jones, who's a fellow epidemiologist, says, why racism and not race is a risk factor for dying from COVID. So she is saying that it's not race, we're not really interested in race as a social determinant, that race may be a proxy for racism. And that's what we're really interested in, racism. Now, you've already mentioned that race has no basis in biology. Race is an idea that was developed by societies to create and categorize differences among groups of people, often differentiated by a skin color or hair or other features. But importantly, race is used to create and maintain a social hierarchy with human value assigned based on how close one is to whiteness. And so that's important to know the role of race in society. Originally created so that we could rationalize things like slavery because there's a social hierarchy of groups, or we could rationalize genocide of indigenous peoples because there's a social hierarchy. Also rationalize the benefits that some groups got, white plantation owners from some of these systems here. So having a hierarchy in race was important to those economic systems. Racism, on the other hand, is a system, and it confers both advantages and disadvantages. It's a structural system that assigns value and either grants or deprives opportunities and privileges based on race. Structural racism exists in all aspects of society. And that means if we're talking about all aspects of society, it exists in science and it exists in epidemiology as well. And we need to think about how it's affecting our work. So when we think about racism, then, if it is a system, we need to measure the whole system when we possibly can. We need to measure what's happening at the individual level when we demonstrate some of those differences. But we also have to demonstrate what's happening when it comes to racism at the individual level, which are about attitudes and beliefs, but then what shapes those attitudes and beliefs, and what might be happening at a systems level, institutional discrimination at organizations or in society when we're talking about policies and norms and attitudes. So we really should be looking at the whole system when we can. Because when we document those inequities here on the right, those come from racial discrimination. So to answer my own question that I posed earlier, why are we interested in race? And then to follow what Dr. Kamara Jones was saying, we're really interested in racism. Racism that's happening at the individual, institutional, and societal policy level is what's determining those racial inequities. But the racial discrimination that's happening at these levels don't just occur out of nowhere or spontaneously generate. In fact, there is the system in place that shapes that and creates that. So the system is comprised of our beliefs and our attitudes, our way of thinking based on stereotypes, and those stereotypes are often negative and exaggerated for racialized individuals, and they're held by individuals, by groups, by decision makers, by politicians, and they're embedded and reinforced by oppressive power relations, right? So who gets hired, who doesn't get hired, all of those are oppressive power relations. Who gets to determine where individuals live, et cetera, all of those are affected by these beliefs and stereotypes. And the ultimate root cause then are these systems that we have, our worldview, which is informed by a colonial and a racist ideology. Our structural racism. I mentioned before settler colonialism and where some of these early ideas came from about racial hierarchy. And also something that's very active, but often we don't talk about it, is our system of white supremacy. White supremacy is a system that assumes that the practices of whiteness are the right way of organizing human life. While the term evokes images of extreme hate groups, that's not really what we're referring to here when we talk about white supremacy and white privilege. White supremacy refers to the presumed superiority of white racial identities, again, referring to that racial hierarchy, in support of cultural, political, and economic domination of non-white groups. So Bond suggests that if racism and privilege that we tend to see down here at the right of this framework are the symptoms of the system, white supremacy is the disease that we need to treat. And so if these systems are in place, systemic racism, for example, white privilege, we need to think about how this is playing out in our epidemiologic research. I don't know if you've given that some thought, but we can certainly talk about that. And I can share with you some examples, and which is just the tip of the iceberg that I'm familiar with. But this system is present everywhere, including in our science, even though we claim to be objective. In fact, we are influenced by this. The good news is that while we don't hear a lot about white supremacy and white privilege and structural racism, we're starting to see more studies that are coming out that address this issue. So maybe not in 2015 did we see studies with either structural racism, white privilege, or white supremacy in the title or abstract, But as we move closer to today, we can see that there is an increase in studies that are looking at the impact of systemic racism, white privilege, and white supremacy on well-being and on our science. So I mentioned a minute ago about how some of our epidemiology might be affected by some of these systems, and it could unintentionally create harms to populations. And I think we need to talk about it and think about it. You know, some of these topics are really difficult to engage with, but I think it's really important because I know that nobody or everyone who's a scientist wants to do well. They want to make positive change. And when we create unintentional harm, we need to be aware of it. So there's the question on the table about whether some of the explanations that we come up with for ubiquitous inequities, where certain racialized groups consistently occupy unfavorable positions, and we don't really have great explanations for it. They're not contextualized. We don't provide the historical or the political context. Maybe we're using a deficit approach consistently, or we have poor proxies for the actual exposure that we're interested in. Are those sources of unintentional harm? Back in 1996, some colleagues and I were really frustrated with how epidemiologists were interpreting race. And we wanted to call attention to poor scientific practices. It's actually a good practice to start becoming critical and recognizing and questioning poor scientific practices. So at the time, there was a book that was out called The Bell Curve. You may or may not be familiar with it. And the bell curve was very problematic. Everyone could clearly see that it was an example of scientific racism, where the authors claimed that IQ was related to race and IQ and race were biological. It was a clear example of both scientific racism and biological determinism. And in a book like that, which caused so much controversy, it was easy to see how the science was problematic. But we were arguing that many epidemiologists were doing something similar by invoking biology and inherent differences by race when we talked about race in our epidemiologic research. So here we're talking about biological determinism and how it shows up, and the examples I contributed to this article were in the MCH world. And it's not about calling out individuals, let me make that clear. It's about calling out common scientific practices which might be bringing harm. A more recent example was just last year. There were some Canadian colleagues using an amazing big data set trying to look at homicide. And they ended up calling out a small group, a very small proportion of this population, refugees. And in this study, they ended up not providing context. For example, when you think about immigrants and refugees, they've certainly been under fire these past couple of years. Certainly the last US president promoted Islamophobia and trying to encourage or discourage migration of certain groups, and really fueled a lot of hate crimes. And if you're talking about immigrants and refugees, you really need to provide that current political context that's happening, especially if you're talking about homicide, since 85% of hate crimes, which were on the rise, are fueled by racism. So that practices were so egregious in this article that we felt the need to write a letter calling out some of the harms that were done. Here's a list of the harms. I won't go through it in detail with you. Needless to say, so much of it was based on those beliefs that I mentioned to you. They had unfounded claims about how immigrants are dangerous, even if there's evidence to the contrary. They're violent, they're prone to violence against women. So there were a lot of unfounded comments that were negatively labeling this group. And so it was a very problematic example of how our science and how not using social theory can bring about harm. This is in the Journal of Epi and Community Health. you wanted to look at the exchange. I think the last point that I wanted to bring up was, and I'll make it quick because I know we're running out of time here, because I want to make sure we engage in an exercise. It's the 10-year anniversary of a book that I co-edited with my colleague Jim Dunn, who is the editor of the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health. And we wanted to call on fellow social epidemiologists to make sure that we're really using our science for change in two ways. One is, we're great at demonstrating these gaps and talking about our research on inequities that way, but we're not so great at identifying modifiable causes of inequities or developing solutions around them. So that solution-focused research is really what we need to do more of. There's another imbalance where the number of studies and the ratio of studies that are studying problems versus solutions is very, very high. So we need to correct this imbalance. And while it's changing, it's still a little bit slow. So we need to think about proper interventions and interventions to evaluate. And we'll talk a little bit more about those tools in about a week or so. So to summarize then this section here, we need data and theory on intermediate and structural determinants of health to inform what Mike referred to last time, consequential research questions. We need data, theory, and research on social determinant risks and solutions, with much more of the latter. And so in the next section, we'll talk about whether or not we're equipped to proceed. And again, I'm hoping that in this section, you were able to receive the answers to some of these questions here. So I was going to go to a poll, and we end at 4. Is that right, Ashley? Okay, I can see you. Yeah. So what I'd like to do is maybe take a few minutes to do a little bit of an exercise. Now, on Teams, oh, I should have mentioned Teams earlier. On Teams, there is a sheet in the file folder, and it is called, sorry, I'm not there now. Okay, so it's in introductory materials, and it's in the files, and it's under social determinants materials, and it's called Improving My Epi Practice on the Social Determinants of Health. I'd like you to download that and spend about 5 minutes really answering maybe 2 of the questions for yourself. Oh, I have a link in a slide. Let me try and pull it up. Yeah. There we are. Okay, improving my epi practice on the social determinants of health. So maybe 5 minutes alone on either 2 or 4 of these questions. So what key messages did you take away? What ideas require more clarification? What points have relevance to your own epidemiology research? What strategies might you implement to improve your own research on social determinants? And what strategies that you'd like to use but could benefit from further assistance, either inside this training program or maybe outside the training session? It's just a way for you to process what you've heard, challenge what you've heard, and think about some ways to improve your own epi practice. So hope you found it in the Teams, and we'll give you 5 minutes. And then I'm going to ask Ashley to maybe break you up into small groups so that you can discuss that for about 10 minutes.
We hope the 10 minutes wasn't too fast, but we want to be respectful of time and open it up for discussion before the end. So I'll hand it back over to Pat. Once we get, looks like there's still a few joining us in the main session. So just maybe one more beat before.
Just wanted to make sure my mic was on. Great. Okay.
Okay, looks like we're all back. So go ahead, Pat.
Wonderful. All right. Hope you had an interesting time thinking about improving your own epi research and some of the practices that you want to use. And hopefully we can have a conversation about that at the end. I wanted to just quickly cover this topic about some skills and approaches we can use to improve our epi research or epi our projects, as Carol corrected me. I use the word research a lot, but I really mean our projects, our applied research projects. So in this section, I think it's important to talk about the answers to these questions, although we don't have a lot of time, so I'm kind of zip through these, but I'm happy to answer any questions about these particular questions here. I know that we're all kind of on our own journeys when it comes to thinking about the social determinants of health and how we study them and how we approach our projects and our team and affected communities. Some of the ways in which epidemiologists have written about improving their own practice is included in this list here. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. So if you have some ideas and some experiences of how you've done it, please share. The purpose of this training program is to learn from each other, not just to learn from or hear from the instructors. One approach would be to create cross-disciplinary project or applied research teams to include experts who are focused on historical or political or social evidence about the social determinants of health. In public health, we're often very biomedically focused because we're very close to medicine, and we don't often get these perspectives on politics and social factors. Including affected community perspectives into your work via collaboration and partnerships, for example, community-based participatory research. Critically engage with inequality research and question poor scientific practices, as I mentioned to you before. Although that's not easy to do, I can certainly share my share of backlash that I experienced when I did those things. And know and name your own contributions to widening inequities, given your social location, and commit to deepening your own practices of cultural competence, cultural humility, and allyship with affected communities. And as I mentioned, there are more things that we could be doing. When I told you about my recent calling out of poor scientific practices of that Canadian study, one of the things we did call for was meaningful community engagement to avoid harms. If there was meaningful engagement in that study, which we know there wasn't, I doubt that many of the things that were printed in that article would have actually been said. And so when we think about community engagement, it follows the continuum. So often we have none down on the left, but as we go up the continuum of the community engagement, we pass cooperation, coordination, and then we land all the way at partnership or community-based participatory research. That's not to say that one is better than another, and you need a different set of skills for each one. But engaging community is important to doing some of this work on the social determinants of wealth, to bring in the perspectives of those with lived experience and expertise. I just wanted to share that in Canada, Indigenous communities have essentially said they've had enough of the experience of having research done to them. There have been hundreds of years of research on Indigenous peoples, and they have concluded that no good has come of that research. Their situations have not improved. In fact, they've only gotten worse. And so they've rejected it. They reject traditional models of research where they're not part of the project team. Now we're required by funders in Canada to adhere to Indigenous research ethics and principles. We're required to share budgets. We're required to allow Indigenous communities to own data. And some of the Indigenous communities have come up with their own Indigenous research ethics and principles. For example, First Nations have come up with the idea of OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession. Ownership means a community or group owns information collectively. Control affirms that the Indigenous community has control of research at all stages. Access refers to the fact that First Nations must have access to information and data about themselves, no matter where that data is held. So if I went out and I did a survey of urban Torontonians, and there's a lot of Indigenous peoples who live in Toronto, and I collected some data on Indigenous communities, I would be obliged to share that with, for example, organizations that serve Indigenous communities. And possession refers to the physical control of the data. It's a mechanism by which ownership can be asserted and protected. So it's an interesting model of partnership, and they even have online tools to implement OCAP. You might want to check out their online tools. The benefits of CBPR and its derivations are that it builds trust, it leads to the use of culturally appropriate measurement instruments. Projects and interventions are going to be more relevant, effective, and efficient. We can share control in the interpretation and presentation of research findings, which allows communities a greater say in their own futures. And that's really important. It also yields a deeper two-way understanding of the community's unique circumstances and a more accurate framework for testing and adapting best practices. And so, you know, in order to do this kind of work, I know I was not trained in epidemiology to think about community partnered research. So we're going to have to do some work on ourselves to make ourselves able to engage in trusting, meaningful partnerships. I put a resource in the Teams, which you just might want to take a look at, where Dr. Stephanie Nixon talks about a model she developed, which shows how the system of inequality that we just named can be thought of as a coin with two sides. One side we're very familiar with, the way in which systems oppress individuals and create disadvantage in some groups. We are great at naming that and seeing that. We're less great at naming and seeing the privilege that happens and what our own privileges are that we bring to the table. We're kind of blind to that, and that can get in the way of good partnerships. And she talks about it isn't just one coin, but it's multiple coins that we need to see both sides of. We need to see the multiple privileges that we bring to the table, or potentially the multiple oppressions that we may be experiencing or others on our research team might be experiencing. So I think the last point I want to make is it's not just about acquiring these new research processes, but it really is about transforming communities. And to do that, we have to share power. In order to share power, we probably have to do something differently amongst ourselves and with ourselves. So it would be important for us to think about what one action could be that maybe you can commit to today to begin your own journey toward greater cultural humility, meaningful engagement with affected communities, to improve research, to make it more impactful, and to help communities, because I think that's why we're all in this business here. I just want to end with one quote from one of my favorite authors, Arundhati Roy. And she says that another world is not only possible, but she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her. And so I'm hoping that we will really look at our work, look at our research, look at ourselves, so that we can make way for that other world, because she is on her way. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And I just wanted to make note, we do have until about 34 more minutes. Today's session is a little bit longer than the others, so we have time for discussion, questions, comments, anything. So feel free to put on your video so we can see you all, unmute, utilize the chat. all of those functions.
Great, thanks. I was worried we were finishing at 4, so I rushed, but that's good because I really want to hear from you. So how were your discussions, or how was your self-reflection about something that you might do differently? Anyone want to unmute or go to the chat? Or if we want to do a poll, we can. That might be a way to see what everybody said. Maybe I'll turn that poll on. Let's see. Next. All right. Okay, the poll is activated if you want to go to the poll and talk about one thing that you want to do differently or to begin your journey for meaningful engagement.
Hi, this is Bitola, and I have more of a comment from the discussion group that I was part of. And one thing that resonated with all of us was the limited capacity of epidemiologists to, we thought about this in a research frame, that sometimes we don't have the background information to really address the social determinants of health. So beyond just race, age, and maybe sex, the underlying causes, many of the data that we have sometimes don't have those variables in there. And then something else that came up was how the apparent divide between epi and data and programs. So when programs need data, sometimes because the epidemiologists are not involved in the life cycle of that project, it's hard to really advocate for this is what you should have included in the data collection phase. And that might hinder the ability to look at the root causes when we're trying to do that.
Yeah, those are real problems for sure. Maybe I'll talk about that. Well, maybe, okay, I'll deal with the first question first, and that is not all epidemiologists have the expertise or the background to know in depth each of the social determinants that might be relevant for what they're working on. I think that's true, and I think that's why one of the suggestions that was made was maybe creating cross-disciplinary teams of inviting individuals who do have that expertise. If you're working at a state health department, there might be others who are working. Let's just use an example of housing, since we talked about it earlier. Maybe somebody's working on housing programs and they're willing to come visit you or talk to you or tell you about what is the context of housing in different communities in your state, or for community X, whatever you're working on. You might be able to reach out to experts who are working. Frontline people are so knowledgeable about these things. That's what I found. I found them to be an amazing source of information. They just know what's happening on the ground. They know the history, they know the context, they know the politics. When I meant interdisciplinary, I didn't necessarily mean academics. I'm not sure I would go to academics. I would go to the frontline people first. I think they really know what's happening. So that would be one way of adding expertise on a variety of things, whether it's employment that you're focusing on or other issues. They often know and have been working in those issues for a long time. So that could be a source of information. Hopefully that answered your question. As you said, often we don't have access to that information. If we're working on a program or an evaluation or an analysis for a program, they didn't collect it, they didn't consult you early enough, and so you don't have it. One thing you could do is you could describe the context in which that may be happening. Let's say that you're working on a program, totally making this up. And maybe it's about poverty and you have information on income, but you don't have anything on employment, for example. And you thought employment might be really important to understand what's happening in a program. Again, totally making this example up. Maybe you have a real one that you want to share. You can still describe the context of what's happening in that community, in different communities. What's the unemployment rate? Not only what's the unemployment rate, but what do the unemployment policies look like? I remember when I was doing some work on unemployment policies, I kind of knew that not everybody was eligible for unemployment insurance, but boy, when I started doing that work on unemployment insurance, I realized just how few people are actually eligible for unemployment benefits. So even though we think in our minds, if you're unemployed, you have unemployment benefits, too few people have access to that. So that might be important context that you want to describe in your reports, even if you don't have that data on every individual in your data set. I do think we often don't provide enough important context to programs, to populations in our reports. Certainly in our published papers, we don't have enough room to do it, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. So I'm hoping that I provided some reasonable answers to your questions, and there might be others who want to share strategies that they've done. Would love to hear from you. Does anybody have any suggestions to provide? Somebody else just mentioned frontline workers in the chat. Thank you. So maybe I can take some of the questions in the chat. So there's a comment about we work with contracted community providers to provide services. Because they're on the front lines, we get good feedback about the broader community context as a cross-disciplinary team. Great, thank you. Tell the story of the data from intersectionality of the SDOH lens. Still trying to figure out how to help with telling the story when there's no platform for discussing the data or the report. So are you talking about there's just a report and it's disseminated, but there's no way to have a webinar and interact with people or things like that? I would think that in the context of Zoom and the pandemic, that there would be more opportunities to offer webinars. I have never done so many webinars coming out with the findings of my research and reaching out to audiences where I would normally hold an in-person workshop, right? So, or a session to release things, but actually I reach many more people now. So I don't know if that's a possibility for sharing. Okay, thank you for those comments. And intersectionality came up again. Maybe we can have a discussion about that, because I'd love your opinion on intersectionality. Okay, we include SDOH measures in our reports, but often receive pushback from higher ups when we talk about systemic factors and systemic racism. As I mentioned before, this work isn't going to make everybody feel comfortable. The social determinants of health are really challenging systems of power often. And so they are going to make some people feel uncomfortable. I'm not sure I have great answers for you to, I certainly don't want you to lose your job. I'm not sure how much pushback that you're receiving, but there might be some ways to make some people feel more comfortable with these ideas. I think that when I give talks, for example, I talk about the research that exists that has come before on these topics. I don't know if the higher ups would feel more comfortable if other studies have talked about systemic factors and systemic racism. So in a way, you're just quoting others. Thinking about ways to let people know that it's okay is really important. Maybe some of these ideas might come from community themselves, that that's what they want to talk about. And that might be another way of convincing higher ups about the importance of it. Or Another way is to pitch it in a positive way. I recently gave a talk, Mike knows, and I gave an example of a positive, not quite reversal, but addressing a systemic issue that happened in Evanston, right, in Illinois. What they did is they recognized the systemic racism that happened around housing and redlining and things like that. They did a historical look. I think they went back a century and documented all the ways in which Black communities were systemically discriminated against over 100 years. And they decided to do something about it. They were giving reparations. And so they used cannabis money to give reparations around the systemic discrimination that happened. And so that's a positive example of addressing a systemic issue. So we don't always have to give negative examples. I'd love to hear more positive examples from you if you have some from your community. So I think that's a great example of talking about systemic issues, you know, systematic discrimination over time, and how the government is trying to fix that. And I suggest you check it out. It's kind of an exciting story. Okay, other comments. A surveillance report that's pre-formatted or completed on a schedule. I see. So it's hard to work in other areas that you want to explore, other issues, because you have a tight schedule, and then there's no room in the pre-formatted report to put it in. That is tough. I don't know if you can have an appendix or a companion to the report, or when you go out and you talk about it, you give the context outside the report or in your slides and maybe not in the report. So these are strategies to think about expanding your report, even if it's pre-formatted. We've created a framework on the drivers of inequity, racism versus race, history of redlining versus housing, inequitable access to the GI Bill versus education. Great, that's wonderful. Would love to hear more, Allison, about how you use that and maybe how the higher ups have accepted that, because that might be something that everybody can learn from.
Hi, this is Allison. So we have a departmental racial equity initiative, and this is something that my office created, and we've slowly but surely shared, you know, division-wide, bureau-wide, et cetera. You all who work in state government probably know what that's like. And I feel like within our bureau and within our providers, they've been really receptive to like really talking about things in a more targeted way. Honestly, the frameworks looks very similar to what you shared, Pat. And we just kind of modified it a bit, but we haven't done more with that. We've shared it some like presentations, me and my colleagues, but yeah, don't know how upper level senior leadership at the Department of Public Health would feel. And yeah, happy to share it also with the team if people want to see.
Wonderful, that would be great. Ashley, if she shares it with the team, should she put it in this, the SDOH folder maybe? I'm not sure, where should she put it?
Yes, and Allison, if you want to send it to me via email, or you can add it into the Teams as well. So whatever you're comfortable with, and you can put it as a PDF version with your organization's name on it as well, too.
Okay, thank you.
Carol Gilbert, one of the faculty, has given us some more fuel for suggesting that we need to look at systemic factors. She said that individual level factors do not explain variation as well as systemic policy factors. So that could be kind of an epidemiologic approach to talk about, that you want to have the best variables, the best data, and in doing so, you need to include systemic issues. Allison noted that there's a great episode of the New York Times, The Daily, on reparations in Evanston. Great. Including health disparity training, including leadership in health disparity training. I think that would really be amazing. I think everyone needs training, frankly. So including everyone, including leadership in health disparity training is a great idea. So Becky is talking about redlining in Columbus compared to infant mortality rates to help people understand the issues are systemic. Yeah, the more recent history is hard, although I'm wondering how COVID has opened up our ability to talk about recent history and what's going on now. I know there's some good COVID data happening in the US. In Canada, we don't collect race data, and we're talking about starting to do it because people wanted to know what the COVID patterns were by race. But I'm wondering if COVID has created an opening and an acceptability to talk about some of these things and current discrimination. So how can you make sure that all groups are accurately represented and disparities are identified when small groups often have data suppressed for privacy reasons? For example, when we look at COVID vaccines cases and deaths, it can be difficult to demonstrate disparities when the data aren't there. Yeah, that is such an important issue because ideally we want all groups to be seen, even if there are small numbers. We don't want erasure going on, but I agree with you. I think that's the small numbers issue is a real problem. I don't know if some of the other faculty want to talk about how they have dealt with this issue. I think it's a real challenge. You know, one way to talk about it is to come up with best estimates and maybe talk about it in the text. You know, I mentioned that, so maybe this group was high, but not present the actual percentage. I guess I just want to say something, and, you know, I know Canada's a small country, but you might learn some things from it. In Canada, we are talking about, should we have data routinely collected on our health records? Right now, we don't. We have great health data, but none of it has race. And there have been quite a few debates about whether we should move forward with that or not, recognizing that there have been harms, you know, always reinforcing the idea that there might be a racial hierarchy could be a harm. For example, when I listen to two Black scholars that I really respect, they talk about maybe not needing to report everything by race. Now, in our case, we have to collect the data first, then we have to analyze it, and then we have to report it. For us, it would take us a couple of years to even report on COVID and race. So that is taking up a lot of time, whereas you don't have that problem in the US. And so Dr. Ronaldo Walcott was talking about how maybe we should spend that precious time immediately going to design solutions, because we already know that racialized populations are doing worse when it comes to COVID for a variety of reasons. We can kind of describe the context and the political context and the history, and we know the answer. We don't have to invest 3 to 4 years to actually come up with the data. And I think Ruha Benjamin, I was on a panel with her, she's at Princeton, and she too questioned the need to keep demonstrating this over and over again. She wonders if we already know what the racial inequities are without actually measuring the magnitude, because we've demonstrated this with so many outcomes. Do we really need to keep doing it? And in that sense, you know, and we think about the social determinants, where do we want to put our public money, our efforts? I would argue that we need to do more of the looking at solutions, looking at interventions, evaluating programs, because we're never going to get the programs right until we start evaluating them. And that may be a better use of money. I'm not saying I know that it is, but I'm raising a question about that. And that's something to think about. Oh, right. So I wanted to say, you know, maybe there's ways to just describe rates that they were high or low in certain small groups without actually sharing the data and sharing small cells. That might be an alternative to either not reporting at all or creating an other category where everybody, there's a little bit of erasure going on there, right? So Becky says, I do think that has helped in Columbus, at least. Our health commissioner is very focused on health equity in COVID rates and vaccination rates. That's great. So Jessica's piggybacking on Kyle, not only with small numbers in COVID, but we had a lot of incomplete information. Yeah, that is a problem. You know, I think you're doing your best, right, with what you have in front of you. Frankly, I think each one of you is doing amazing work. You know, you have a lot of data challenges, a lot of variable challenges, a lot of challenges with making sure you get the right explanations and not causing harm, and then missing data, etc. So again, I think if you can and you have the room, reporting what you have and just noting the limitations. But again, others may have better ways of dealing with it. So I'd love to hear. I want to hear from the other faculty too. You all have great experience on this.
So one thing that I'll add is just a plug for mixed methods, right? I mean, we're epidemiologists and we focus a lot on the qualitative analysis, the quantitative analyses, but especially when you're trying to illuminate something that, as you're saying, Pat, that we can show is true in other ways, trying to understand some of the depth that's going on there, right, that we wouldn't be able to capture in the quantitative data by talking to people, right, that are most affected, you know, through key informant interviews, through focus groups, things like that, and summarizing those data in a meaningful way to make some, you know, sometimes to make sure that we're not overlooking and erasing groups, but sometimes to be able to say things that we haven't been able to say before, right? I mean, I think using the qualitative data that we can collect and the quantitative data that we have more readily available together can be really powerful, and it's something that that in many cases folks in state and local health departments are sometimes well positioned to do. If you're working with a lot of community partners, right, you can have sometimes access to people with a lot of expertise.
I know when I worked with the Healthy Start folks in Baltimore, and I did that for many, many years, they always thought I was too picky about data. They kind of wanted any data, and any data would help them make decisions. And I don't mean they had terrible data, but you know, I would say, oh, well, we need to have at least this many. And they'd be like, no, I'm okay with whatever you have. And they used that information. And I think they used it responsibly and well. And so sometimes just sharing the data, you know, you're not publishing these data necessarily. So I don't think you're risking identifying anybody with a small cell. But certainly those planners can use any data because they often have to make decisions without data. So for them, any data is better than none.
And I would just make a plug to the small numbers issue, remembering that as epidemiologists, we aren't only analysts, but we may be involved in designing. And design is a really important, study design is a good place to address small numbers. And one example in MCH is the way we can reinvent the sampling design for PRAMs in the state to oversample strata that you want to have an adequate number for. So that's not always something we can do just to sample more of a small cell, but there are times when we can bake in a design that ensures that we have an adequate number of respondents of a particular strata of interest.
All right, let's see if there's not any more in the chat now. Maybe I'll share the last poll that we did. All right. Do you see? Here we go. One action I will take to begin or continue my journey toward meaningful engagement with affected communities is always include stakeholders in conversation. Our Maternal Mortality Review Committee is beginning to incorporate surviving family member interviews into our maternal death review process to get an idea of women's experiences which aren't captured in medical or other records. Great. Advocate for multidisciplinary background research teams. Whoa, what happened there? Skipped ahead. Okay. Emphasize the importance of highlighting racism and impact of other systems of oppression as the risk factor root cause. Race and place aren't the root cause, but rather racism, xenophobia, sexism, ableism, etc. Think critically about how to develop research questions that utilize data and theory on intermediate and structural social determinants of health. Data visualizations and surveys. Find and use more measures of experiences of discrimination. Dig deeper into the root causes, working to include more lived experience. Research and study CBPR. Advocate for including community members in discussions and listening to them, allowing them to identify solutions. More research in structural factors. Build relationships, so important. Include affected communities in the conversation. You started doing this and it really makes a huge difference. Totally agree. Unbiased data. Oops, that was the last one. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm hoping that we can share more with each other because some of us have done these things and we might share some of our lessons learned. I know that I've learned the most from my failures. So I'm happy to share all my failures with you so that you won't repeat those mistakes. And I've got a lot to share. So ask me about my failures for sure. I think, there's another chat comment. Montana PRAMS oversamples American Indian population in order to try and increase response rates for that group in particular. Excellent, that's good. Same with Wyoming. Very good. So already starting to deal with some of those small numbers issues. Any other comments or questions? If not, I'm not sure if Mike or Ashley or any of the other faculty want to weigh in on social determinants. Oh, I will make a plug for some of the roundtables that you have requested. And we're talking about health equity and social determinants and things like that. So sign up for those roundtables and also sign up for some of the one-on-ones with faculty in the general files area. Okay. And all right, over to you, Mike and Ashley, or any of the faculty who want to weigh in.
So I will say that we started our course this year with this topic intentionally. I think that it fits where we are as a field, and I think that was reflected in some of the titles that you came up with during our activity today. So we started with this topic. As Pat mentioned, we're going to have opportunities for small group and roundtable discussions on this topic. The faculty, where it makes sense, are going to try to weave examples of social determinants of health throughout the course. And then we are going to end with a roundtable, not a roundtable, a panel discussion with some of the foremost experts in the world in research around social determinants of health. So this is going to be a theme throughout the training course this year, and I'll just say again that was intentional on the part of the faculty as we put this together. I hope that I hope that the whole course and the the focus on this theme is beneficial to your professional development and your personal growth.
Thanks, Mike. And so, as Pat mentioned, there is an opportunity to sign up for one-on-one office hours with the faculty. That is in the general channel listed in the files. It's an Excel sheet. So the faculty have designated some 15-minute blocks that you are able to sign up for if you're interested in that, just for some discussion over your projects, analyses, questions, career development, those types of things. We also are preparing roundtable discussions. We will have one probably looking at this week, sometime in the middle of the week. We'll just open up a Zoom and we'll have one of the faculty leading and kind of guiding that open discussion over social determinants of health, health equity, multivariable regression, and outcome evaluation. So you'll have details sent out when those are finalized, and it'll just be an open discussion. It won't be formal or presentation style. We'll just come and discuss and share and learn from one another. So with that, I think that is all for today. Thank you all for joining us. You'll get the recording link and an evaluation from me as to be expected for the next 9 sessions. So again, thank you. Thanks to the faculty.
And starting on Wednesday, we're going to begin to focus on some specific analysis techniques and things like that. So Ashley Harai from HRSA is going to be with us on Wednesday to talk about performance measurement and analytic approaches for performance measurement. It's going to be really good. Ashley is just awesome. If you know her, you know that she's incredible. And then we'll finish the week on Friday with Bill Sappenfield from the University of South Florida, who's also incredible, talking about needs assessment. So we're gonna focus in on some more epi-specific topics, but again, this will continue to be a theme. All right.
See you Wednesday. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.